Hello, and welcome to Your Health Matters. I'm your host, Dr. Peter Hogenkamp, and today we're going to be discussing one of my very favorite subjects, and that is the role of vitamins in your health. I say it's one of my favorite subjects because, as a practicing physician, it's something that I talk about at least, 10 to 15% of my week. It's a subject that's popular with my patients. They want to know about these things. They want the truth and the real dope on these things. And so I thought I'd use today's program to give you my opinion on the role of vitamins, supplements, and nutraceuticals in your health. By way of introduction, I want to talk about three things. And I want to wrap these three things, which are seemingly unrelated, and we're going to bring them together, and I'm hoping they're going to illustrate what I'm trying to talk about in this segment, and that is that there's a lot of information out there about these things. A lot of it contradicts, and so it becomes difficult to find out what's the truth. And so I'm going to use these three things as overriding principles to guide us in determining what is true about the role of these particular things in our health. So let's start off with Sir Francis Bacon. I know you did not see that coming, but there's a great quote from Sir Francis Bacon which I've used to talk about a lot of different things. And Sir Francis Bacon famously said, "Man prefers to believe what he prefers to be true." And if you think about what's happening in our nation right now, you're going to see that this quote is very relevant for a lot of different things. But I say it today here, on this episode, because if you're one of those people who happens to believe that vitamin C prevents the common cold, then you are going to look and point to the literature and pick out the one or two studies that do give vitamin C some benefit for preventing the common cold. When I look at the literature, I see over 500 studies that have been done on vitamin C and its role in preventing the common cold. And when we do a meta-analysis of these, which is to take all these studies and lump them together and see what the overall benefit is, you'll see that there really is no benefit in vitamin C that's been done in these studies. Now, when we do a meta-analysis, we weight studies differently. If this one study is done better than another, or if it's a more powerful study or has many more people, we give that more weight. And so when you combine them all together, vitamin C has no benefit in the prevention of the common cold. However, people use it all the time. And that goes back to what Sir Francis Bacon said. Man prefers to believe what he prefers to be true. If people want to believe that vitamin C helps, then they're going to go ahead and take it. And they're going to cite those two studies out of 500 that do support it. It's because there's this whole perception that if it's natural, it has to be good. If it's man-made, if it comes from, then it has to be bad. And there is definitely this prevailing thought process out there, especially in our country. Early in my career, I had this woman come into my practice, a very nice lady. I'll never forget her because she had a list of over 30 vitamins and minerals and nutraceuticals that she was taking. It took me most of my appointment just to get them onto her med list. And at the end of the visit, when I suggested that she take high blood pressure medication for her extremely high blood pressure, she was basically insulted and wanted to know if I hadn't been listening to her because she was going to let all these nutraceuticals take care of her issues. So there is a prevailing thought process out there that natural things have to be healthy and that man-made things have to be unhealthy. I always point out that there's a snake venom, and I've forgotten which the particular snake is, but there's a particular snake venom that is the most toxic thing in the world. And that's comes from a snake that lives in Africa or Asia. It's a natural being, and it produces a venom which is the most deadly thing known to man. So, Thunderstorms can be deadly, tornadoes, hurricanes. I would argue that this contention that natural things have to be healthy is not true. The second thing I wanted to talk about is this 1994 law, which was, I love the name of this law, it's the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994. And what this law said was very interesting. I think you're gonna find that, as I do, that it's a little bit counterintuitive. But the law said that people could sell health supplements without any evidence that they are A, effective, or B, safe. And I'm going to restate that because to me it's completely counterintuitive. The law stated that health supplements could be sold without any evidence that they were A, safe, or B, effective. Now, to me, and perhaps I'm a little cynical, I think the law was passed because they were trying to, get the economy rolling, and it actually worked. Because in this country, and this is point number 3 I'm going to make, $30 to $50 billion are spent every year on health supplements, vitamins, and nutraceuticals. So I think the law was based on just trying to boost the economy. As a consequence, though, this whole industry, this health supplement industry, boomed, and it has remained booming to date. As I mentioned, this year probably the amount of money spent on nutraceuticals is going to be over $50 billion. Now, I would argue that $30 to $50 billion could be much better spent, and that there better be a lot of good, a lot of proven good that comes out of the things that people are using this money for. Because otherwise, you could be spending this thing on exercise, on yoga, on meditation, on fruits and vegetables, all kinds of things that we know actually improve your health. So, I wanted to, I've picked out 4 different things to talk about. The first is multivitamins, the second is fish oil, the third would be baby aspirin, and the fourth is glucosamine. Each one of them highlights a particular difficulty, and I think as we discuss each, you're going to see what I'm talking about. Before we start, I want to mention this, and that is right now I'm talking about prevention. If your physician or healthcare provider has recommended for you to take something because of a deficiency that you have or a problem that you have, I don't want you to stop that particular supplementation based on what I'm saying here. What I'm talking about here today is for the average person who doesn't have any issues and does taking fish oil, for instance, prevent this person from developing heart disease. We're strictly talking about prevention, not treatment. And I'm going to go back to that because it's important. Alrighty. So, I wanted to mention one other thing before we go back to, we start with a multivitamin, and that is that if you look at these health supplements, they will say right on them, because it's required by the law, that there is no evidence that these things are effective in all these claims that they make. In other words, they can say that they support a certain type of health. For instance, vitamin D can say it supports immune health without having any evidence. They can't say on the bottle that there's evidence to say that it works. But to be honest with you, when you look at these things, and I have been spending a lot of time looking at these bottles, the data, the wording is pretty convincing. It gets you all pumped up. Well, I'm going to take this vitamin D, and then I'm going to be great. And that is what I'm one of the overall subjects I want to talk about today, and that is why would you not do for yourself? In other words, I think one of the reasons that people spend $50 billion on this industry is because rather than obtain good health for themselves by dieting, by losing weight, by exercising, by meditating, by doing yoga, just take a multivitamin instead. And that's the general approach that I don't like. It's the general approach I think that's fostered by this industry. It's like, you don't have to take care of yourself. We'll take care of you. Just spend 20 bucks on this bottle of vitamins and you'll have good health. And I think I'm going to prove to you in the next 20 minutes that we have left that that's simply a fallacy. Okay, let's start off with multivitamins. Multivitamins alone take up $12 billion of spending per year by Americans. Roughly about 50% of Americans take multivitamins every day. And that includes a lot of physicians, by the way. I thought I'd mention that. So, what is the evidence that suggests that multivitamins are good for you? Well, in the early days, there were a lot of studies done. There were very small studies done, many of them sponsored by the lab that made the particular multivitamin. And they simply gave people some vitamins, and they said, listen, take this every day and report to us whether you feel better. And as you can just tell by the way I worded it, these were very poor studies. But in these very poor studies, people say, I took a multivitamin today and I felt better. There was no placebos. There was no selection of the patients. It was simply these, kind of an observational study, as we like to call them. And these observational studies, and some of them were a little bit more complex than this, did show a benefit to multivitamins. So the use of multivitamins took off as a consequence, to the point where today, in 2020, $12 billion will be spent on multivitamins. So, because of their prevalent use, physicians decided to dedicate studies to them. And I want to talk about 3 studies in particular. The first one is about the role of multivitamins in heart disease. And this study had 450,000 people. And I say that because a study with 10 people is obviously not going to be as powerful as a study with 100 people. A study with 450,000 people is going to be powerful just from the extent that the number of people in the study is something we call N, but that the N of 450,000 makes it a worthwhile thing to look at. In this particular study, there was no decrease in the risk of cancer or heart disease when people took multivitamins. Again, this was an observational study, so it's kind of picking people, selecting people and looking back at them over the last 10 or 15 years. It's called a retrospective study. We're looking back in time. And by their very design, these studies are less powerful than forward-looking studies. Forward-looking studies mean you take people and you say, all right, we're going to put you on this particular medicine or a placebo, and we're going to move forward and see how you do. These forward-looking studies tend to be much less biased, and they tend to be much more powerful. So, in a forward-looking study of 6,000 people, you'll notice the number is a lot smaller because these are a lot more expensive, and so the numbers always are smaller. Following people over 12 years, there was no decrease in heart disease, there was no decrease in cancer, and this particular study also looked at cognitive function, because that's another area where there's a lot of marketing. None of us want to lose our faculties, and people are saying, well, geez, I'll take this vitamin and I'll keep my faculties over the years. But there was no change in cognitive decline. The last study I wanted to talk about was a much smaller study, but there was only 2,000 people in this particular study. But this one was a very good study that was designed by a number of excellent physicians, and it was placebo-based. So in other words, people had to register for the study. They were given either the placebo or the actual multivitamin, and they didn't know which was which, and the physicians in charge of the program didn't know which was which. So this was a double-blinded study. Both the actual participant in the study, or the patient, as well as the physician, the people who were running the study, didn't know. And these double-blinded placebo studies by far are the most telling. They have the most weight because of the design of the study. In this particular study, there was looking at heart disease, and in this study, there were actually people who already had heart disease, which makes them a high-risk population, and that's another a way to increase the power of a study is by taking people who are at high risk. Obviously, if they've already had heart disease, they're at high risk for developing more of it. And in these people, which was done over 6 years, they found no decrease in the recurrence of heart disease by people taking multivitamins. Interestingly enough, there's a physician's health study where physicians are actually enrolling themselves in this forward-looking study. 14,000 physicians over 10 years, and they found no benefit at all in the reduction of heart disease, cancer, or cognitive decline. So, what so people ask me, I go through this all the time with my patients, and they're saying to me, all right, doc, so I take a multivitamin, as 52% of the population does. What could be the harm of it? And this is one of the overriding principles I wanted to talk about today. There could be quite a bit of harm, because you could say to yourself, well, you know what? I'm not going to bother making myself a really nice meal today because I had a multivitamin. I'll just go to a fast food restaurant and have a couple of cheeseburgers and a Diet Coke. And this is a very real phenomenon. This idea that people will take a medicine or a pharmaceutical or something else, a supplement, a nutraceutical, however you want to label them, and they'll actually then not do for themselves. They'll take something, not do for themselves. It's what I spend half of my work time trying to reverse, and that is that you, as are the number one physician for you, you should be taking care of yourself. You shouldn't let your physician be your primary care doctor. You are your primary care doctor. And the first thing that you can do is take control of your health. I'm asking you to do that not by taking a multivitamin, because I think the data here is very clear, but by actually eating well, exercising, keeping your weight down, not smoking, limiting your alcohol. All right, so let's go on to the second thing, and that is fish oil. Fish oil supplementation is an excellent example of how complicated this area is. The whole idea that fish oil would be good for you started with the observation that the Inuit population had a lower risk of heart disease than the regular population. And what's interesting about it is that the Inuits were actually quite a bit heavier than the regular population. This was studied started in the 70s, at which time the rest of the world was quite a bit leaner than they are now. Actually about 20 pounds leaner than they are right now. But when these two researchers, they were Danish researchers, Bang and Dyerberg, and they went and they actually concocted this study in 1970 that was actually very famous. And it's now called the myth of the Eskimo diet. But at the time, it was taken very seriously. And that's because we wanted it to be true. We want there to be some magic bullet for us to keep ourselves healthy. We don't want to have to go to the gym or run every day. We want to just have a magic bullet. So these two Danish gentlemen went and they conducted this very flawed study in Iceland in the 70s. And this started the myth of the Eskimo diet. This idea that eating fish or having a lot of fish in your diet would protect you against heart disease. So from the idea of eating fish a lot came this whole idea of, well, rather than eating fish, because that seems like a lot of work and it's expensive and your kitchen smells if you have fish, to just taking fish oil supplements. And so fish oil supplementation became very popular to the tune of, in 2019, $1.2 billion was spent on over-the-counter fish supplements alone. So, when anything becomes popular in medicine, one of the things that we do, which I think is very laudable, is that we then say, all right, we're doing this. Is this a good idea? And so we actually study the whole phenomenon. So many large-scale studies were done. I was just reviewing them this morning. I'm not going to bore you with the intricate details of these studies, but the long and short of it was that over-the-counter fish oil supplementation was of no benefit in reducing heart disease whatsoever. And it basically kind of debunked this whole idea. When those studies happened, they went back and looked at the study from Doctors Bang and Dyerberg, and they found that the methods of their studies were actually quite poor. And a lot of the conclusions that they draw were based on these methods which were not accepted and viable methods. And in other words, there was a lot of bias in the study. There was a lot of error induced into the study. And it's one of the things that I like to talk to my patients about. Just because a medical study has said something does not necessarily mean that it's true. Because you're always going to find contradicting studies. So when there are contradicting studies, we have to look at the methods, how the studies were conducted. And you have to kind of look, again, is it a forward-looking study? Is it a backward-looking study? How many people were in the study? Was the study sponsored by the pharmaceutical industry? All these things need to be looked at. And I realize that you're looking at me or your healthcare provider to do that. But I think that we can also do that to some extent ourselves. A lot of the articles that I was reading in preparation for this talk were done by healthcare reporters, and I was very, very impressed by the degree of education that these folks have, the degree of intelligence with which they were looking at these studies. So the final word on fish oil is that taking a fish oil supplement off the shelf is not going to do you any good at all. Having said that, there are high-dose fish oil pills that are available by prescription that actually will reduce heart disease in a certain population. And that certain populations as people who have heart disease as a consequence of very, very high triglycerides. If you have that, then the high-dose fish oil supplement, fish oil medications that are available by prescription will help you. But again, it goes back to this whole idea that if it's natural, it's good. And the fish oil kind of conundrum also speaks to this idea that people love the idea of taking a fish oil supplement rather than eating fish. When we go back and look at the original premise that eating fish is good for you, study after study corroborates that eating fish is good for you. But just because a good diet, a fish is good in your diet, doesn't mean that you know, kind of encapsulating it down into a pill is going to also be good for you. Remember, health is hard work. Taking care of yourself is hard work. You can't just, you know, not exercise, not eat right, be overweight, smoke, drink too much, and take a pill. It doesn't work. I know that I understand the whole idea of it, and at various points in times in my life, I've actually taken multivitamins, even though I know they don't work. There's this whole idea, well, maybe, you know, why does an agnostic say a prayer right before he or she, dies, just on the account that maybe there is a God, kind of thing. And I understand the power of this allure, but I'm just trying to educate you that you're much better off spending your money on other things, like actual fish. Instead of going to the pharmaceutical aisle and buying a fish oil supplement, go to the fish section and buy a lovely piece of salmon. Okay, I wanted to talk about baby aspirin. Baby aspirin is a wonderful example of data that used to be valid that is no longer valid. I have been practicing medicine for 25 years. I graduated from medical school in 1993, graduated from residency in 1996. So I'm almost 25 years as a full-fledged physician, 28 years as a physician in some. And when I started, basically aspirin was considered to be the best thing since sliced bread. I remember giving a talk very soon after I graduated from residency, when I first moved to Rutland, about this same thing, Nutraceuticals, and I was talking, I was listing aspirin as one of the good guys. However, as most of us have seen now, the role of aspirin in preventing heart disease and strokes has been studied extensively in several very, very large, forward-looking studies that were double-blinded and placebo-based. And in those studies, one of which came out just last year in 2019, it was very, very clear that in low-risk patients, in other words, just some guy like me who doesn't have heart disease, who doesn't want to develop heart disease, that taking aspirin does not prevent heart disease. So I want to restate that because this is very important. In the average low-risk individual, taking aspirin is not recommended by physicians to prevent heart disease because it doesn't prevent heart disease. So all the data that we have used in the past, a lot of it was flawed data, and I want to explain how it was flawed because I think it's interesting. It's interesting, at least to me. We started the general recommendation of aspirin in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, at which time we started also the recommendation of much better treatment of blood pressure and the treatment of cholesterol. And so what happened is we saw a huge reduction in heart disease with these things, mainly the treatment of better treatment of blood pressure and the treatment of cholesterol, because prior to the late 70s and early 80s, we didn't really have anything to treat cholesterol with. And we saw this massive reduction in heart disease. But when we went back and teased out what were the individual effects, in other words, what was the effects of blood pressure, what was the effect of cholesterol, what was the effect of aspirin, we found that in the prevention of heart disease for low-risk people, that aspirin actually didn't play any role at all, that it was the role of the other two things that gave us the reduction in heart disease. So, why not take aspirin, just in case? Well, the just in case is that aspirin, as we know, is a blood thinner. And again, a baby aspirin a day is a pretty mild blood thinner, and that was the dose that was recommended in the past for the prevention of heart disease. But we found that even this low dose would actually cause some bleeding complications in enough people to make the risk too great for the fact that there was actually no benefit of doing it. So again, I want to restate this because it's important, because I've had several of my patients who have heart disease stop their aspirin because they read this article. And that's not what we're saying. We're talking about the prevention of heart disease. For those people who have heart disease, and in certain populations who don't have heart disease but who are at high risk for heart disease, we are still definitely recommending aspirin. Aspirin does help prevent heart attacks in people who've previously had them. It does prevent heart attacks in people who are at very high risk for heart disease. So if your physician has recommended to you that you take aspirin, then I want you to still do it. But if you are trying to take aspirin because you want to prevent heart disease, you don't need to do it anymore. Wanted to talk quickly about one last subject, and that last subject is glucosamine. One of the things that people are afraid of getting, in addition to dementia and heart disease and cancer, is arthritis. I have a lot of my patients who are significantly impacted in a negative way by arthritis. And so everybody wants to know, Doc, what can I do to prevent arthritis? And there are a load of health supplements out there that supposedly support arthritis health. If you look at the wording on these things, it's very interesting because it's kind of dubious. But it's working because people buy these things. I'll mention just a few. Turmeric, fish oil, alfalfa, glucosamine, vinegar. It's amazing to me the number of things that people have suggested to me that help their arthritis. And I will say that there's no data to suggest that any of them work at all. I want to talk specifically about glucosamine in the couple of minutes that we have left, because glucosamine is by far the most popular nutraceutical that's used to prevent arthritis. $1 billion a year is spent on glucosamine and its analogs, chondroitin and these combined products. And they did a very large study in 2006. And in that very large study in 2006, which was a forward-looking study with placebo, there was absolutely no benefit to taking glucosamine for the prevention of or treatment of arthritis. So, does that mean you should stop taking glucosamine? Not really. I have a lot of my patients that take it. I generally discourage it. If people feel like they're benefiting it from, that's fine. What I don't like is that they spend money that they might not be spending on medications that we know work. That happens to me all the time. I have patients that won't afford or can't afford their medications, or report to me that they can't afford their medications, and yet they'll spend $10 a month on glucosamine, which we know does not work. How can you prevent arthritis? That is a really, really good question, because the arthritis that I'm talking about, which is osteoarthritis, or what I call wear and tear arthritis, affects all of us to some extent. Some people are blessed and not have much of it at all. Other folks are almost crippled by their arthritis, and sometimes even into their or as early as their 50s and 60s. What I would say that weight management is excellent in terms of reducing arthritis. That's clearly shown, especially with major joint arthritis, such as hips and knees. So if you're going to, if you want to address preventing arthritis, the first thing you should do is address your weight. Spend the money that you would have spent on glucosamine on reducing your weight. I think I've gotten to everything I wanted to get to today. I wanted to just wrap up by saying a couple things. Number one is, if you enjoy this video, and I hope that you have, they are all on the PEG TV site. They're on my Your Health Matters YouTube channel, and they're also on my website, If you're interested in looking some up of the older programs, please go to that. The last thing I wanted to mention is I very, very much appreciate your support, and when people come up to me that they've seen the program and ask me questions, I very much enjoy that. So if you have a question, email me through my website. Have a good day. Cheers.